Turning your place into a shelter now, Daniel the neighbor, mocked voice sharp in the frozen air. Daniel Clayton didn't respond. He stood still watching the wind whip through the yard. Behind him, a veteran's family huddled by the barn, thin coats, tired eyes, and a baby coughing in the cold. They had nothing but a broken-down van and a folded uniform that no one cared to salute. Then came the sound engines growing louder. 3 black SUVs appeared through the mist, followed by military trucks. They stopped at the gate doors, opening in unison. Soldiers in dress uniforms stepped out, forming a line. The neighbors who had laughed now stared in stunned silence. They weren't just visiting. They had come for someone this town had already forgotten. Daniel Clayton wasn't the kind of man who demanded attention. He never raised his voice unless calling in sheep from the hills or warning kids away from the ice pond come winter. At 70, he moved with a slow but steady gait, the kind born from decades of ranch work and military discipline. His hands were weathered, his back stiff, and his eyes, the same sharp hazel that had stared down sandstorms in Iraq, now scanned his Eastern Oregon ranch like a shepherd guarding his last flock. Retired Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army, 23 years served. He never talked much about it, but the medals in the cedar chest upstairs whispered stories no one had the courage to ask about. He'd buried his service beneath flannel shirts, patched boots, and the rhythmic life of sheep ranching after war. 6 years ago, he lost the only person who ever knew all his stories. Margaret, his wife of 44 years, his lighthouse in every storm. Cancer took her, slowly, cruelly, and when the final silence fell across their modest farmhouse, Daniel wasn't just a widower. He was a man untethered. The heart surgery came a year later. It didn't just change his health, it nearly emptied his savings and wiped out most of his flock. What once had been the 300 sheep grazing across 90 acres was now a skeleton crew of 40. He kept them not for profit, but for routine. They gave him something to tend to when the mornings felt too quiet and the nights far too long. He lived simply. Pension checks came in on the 3rd. Groceries were bought every 2 weeks. A single black and white photo of Margaret sat near the kitchen stove, and every evening he still talked to it, just a few words. Sometimes a joke, sometimes a memory. Other times just "Good night, Maggie." The people in town respected him, though they never quite knew what to do with him. Daniel didn't go to church. He didn't gossip in diners or linger at the feed store. But if you needed your roof patched after a storm or your cattle moved before the flood, he'd show up in his old Ford with a tool belt and a thermos of black coffee. He was known for being quiet. Old school, a little hard-headed when it came to what was right and wrong. Daniel didn't do favors for attention. He didn't believe in social media or clicking to care. To him, honor wasn't a word, it was how you treated people when no one was looking. And that's what made what happened next all the more powerful. Because when a man like Daniel Clayton, who'd already buried his past and spent a lifetime doing the right thing in silence, chose to stand up for someone everyone else had walked past, the world had no choice but to pay attention. Especially when the uniform that returned to his ranch didn't come alone. It was late afternoon when the wind changed. Daniel Clayton knew this land well enough to tell when a storm was coming, not by the sky, but by the way the trees went still. The clouds hadn't darkened yet, but the air had that electric edge, sharp and tense. Snow would fall hard within the hour. He'd just come in from checking the barn roof when he heard it, that choking cough of an engine on its last breath. He stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on an old rag, and squinted toward the tree line. A battered minivan emerged from the white. Gray, rusted, and leaning like a tired mule, it crawled down the gravel driveway, wheels slipping in the fresh snow. It made it about 50 feet past the gate before dying completely, one last rattle, then silence. Steam hissed from the hood. The door creaked open and a man stepped out, bracing himself against the wind. Tall, unshaven, dressed in a military surplus jacket several sizes too big. His boots were worn, his eyes alert but hollowed out. Not the kind of hollow that comes from laziness or addiction. Daniel had seen that too. This was different. This was the look of a man who had tried everything and still come up short. Afternoon, Daniel called out, calm and measured. The man raised a hand. "Sorry to just show up," he said, voice rough from the cold. "We've been on the road 3 days. Coming from Kansas." He hesitated. "Car's dead. No heat, no gas, no food. We're just looking for somewhere warm while I figure out how to fix it." From the passenger side, a woman stepped out. She held a bundled infant close to her chest, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. 2 children climbed out, next a girl around 8, and a boy maybe 6. Both of them looked thin, red-cheeked, and quiet as they clung to their mother's coat. Daniel walked down the porch steps slowly. His knees ached from the cold, but he didn't rush. He studied the man's stance the way his eyes scanned the surroundings protectively. Muscle memory. Combat trained, still wired for risk. "What's your name?" Daniel asked, stopping a few feet away. "Jesse Turner," the man replied. 82nd Airborne. 2 tours in Afghanistan. Daniel nodded once. "Clayton, Sergeant First Class Desert Storm." No need for more words. The silence between them said enough. He glanced at the family. The baby coughed again, sharp and dry, and the mother's arms tightened instinctively. "I've got an old bunkhouse," Daniel said. "It's rough, but there's a stove, and it'll keep the wind out." Jesse looked stunned. "Sir, we can't pay. I didn't ask for money," Daniel interrupted. "Get your family out of this cold." A moment later, Daniel was hauling firewood while Jesse carried the baby inside. No questions, no hesitation. Just 2 veterans, different wars. Same code. And for Jesse Turner, who had grown used to locked doors and averted eyes, this moment felt almost impossible. But it was real, and it was warm. The bunkhouse hadn't been used in years. A 1-room cabin tucked behind the barn built by Daniel's father in the 1960s as a place for hired hands to sleep during lambing season. The roof held mostly. The stove groaned, but worked. That was enough. Daniel swept out the dust and cobwebs himself, while Jesse unloaded the family's few belongings: a duffel bag of worn clothes, a tin of formula, and a folded American flag. No complaints, no demands, just quiet gratitude. By dusk, smoke curled from the stovepipe. The kids sat close to the warmth, their mother spooning them soup Daniel had made from scratch. The baby was asleep, her cough easing in the heat. Jesse offered to fix the broken fence out back. Daniel told him to rest. The next morning, Daniel drove into town. At the feed store, he filled the truck with sacks of grain and bales of hay. At the general store, he bought boots, coats, diapers, medicine, canned goods, a space heater, a sled for the kids, and a pair of wool gloves small enough for a boy's hand. Then he stopped at the bank. "All of it?" the teller asked, eyeing the withdrawal slip. "That's your whole savings, Mr. Clayton." Daniel signed the form. "Figure I won't be taking it with me." Word spread fast. By the time he finished loading the truck, people were already whispering. At the gas station, Frank from the neighboring ranch leaned out his window. "You housing transients?" Now, Daniel didn't answer. He was already backing out. That afternoon, as he stacked the supplies in the bunkhouse doorway, he heard the sound of his daughter's car tires crunching in the snow. Rebecca stepped out first, 42, sharp-voiced and practical, principal at the middle school. Behind her came Michael, buttoned up and cautious, the kind of man who always checked the thermostat twice. He worked in insurance. Dad, Rebecca said sharply, eyes on Jesse, who was chopping wood, shirtless in the cold. "What is going on here?" Daniel handed her a pair of gloves. "They're staying in the bunkhouse. Kids were half frozen when they got here." "You gave them shelter?" Michael asked. "And what else? Stanley at the store said you dropped $4,000 on supplies." "They needed it." Rebecca frowned. "You barely know them." Daniel leaned on the tailgate. "I know enough. He served. He's got a family to feed. That's more than most folks have going for them." "You can't save everybody," Michael said. "I'm not trying to. Just this one family." The wind picked up, lifting snow off the roof in gusts. No one spoke for a long moment. Rebecca finally said, "You're risking everything." Daniel nodded. "Then let it be for something that matters." They didn't argue again. But when they left, the silence between them was thick. Inside the bunkhouse, laughter rang out, soft, almost unbelievable. It was the sound of children who'd stopped shivering, and that Daniel thought was worth every dollar. The snow was still falling when Jesse found Daniel on the porch, both of them, nursing mugs of black coffee gone cold. The wind had died down, and for the first time in days, the sky held a pale, fragile light. Neither man spoke for a long while. "You ever carry something so long," Jesse finally said, eyes fixed on the frost-covered fields, "that it just becomes part of who you are, like a scar you forget about, until someone bumps into it." Daniel said nothing, just waited. "I was discharged early," Jesse continued. "Kandahar, 2013. It was supposed to be routine, a convoy inspection near an Allied outpost. I was comms. I should have spotted something, anything, but I didn't." His voice lowered. The ambush killed our CO, Colonel David Garner. Smart, steady, always remembered birthdays and knew every kid's name. The kind of man who'd walk point so his men didn't have to. Daniel slowly set his mug down. Garner. A name like that didn't just pass by unnoticed. I thought I was going to get court-martialed, Jesse said. But they just let me go. Administrative discharge. No ceremony, no handshake. Just silence. He exhaled through his nose. I've been carrying that for years. Alicia tells me to stop blaming myself, but she didn't see him lying there. I did. I was supposed to keep him alive. Daniel turned his eyes toward the distant hills, quiet for a beat too long. Garner, he said slowly. First Lieutenant David Garner, Fort Bragg. Desert Storm. Jesse turned startled. You knew him, knew him. Daniel said, the corner of his mouth twitching with something between disbelief and grief. He saved my life outside Al-Khafji in '91, pulled me out of a burning Humvee with a busted shoulder, said I owed him a steak dinner when we got home. Jesse stared, blinking hard. He never mentioned that. He wouldn't have, Daniel said. That's the kind of man he was. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. You think I let him down, Jesse whispered. I think you're still alive, Daniel answered, which means he'd want you to do something with that. I've known guilt. It's a heavy rucksack, but it doesn't make you stronger to carry it forever. It just breaks you. Jesse looked down at the mug in his hands. Why'd you take us in, really? You didn't know about any of this. Daniel nodded. No, I didn't. But maybe this is the debt I've been waiting to repay. Garner gave me my life. You're part of his story. He paused. And I don't leave a man behind, not even years later. The wind moved again, just enough to stir the snow from the porch rail. Inside the bunkhouse, a baby coughed, and then moments later, the soft murmur of Alicia's lullaby rose into the quiet air. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between the two men. One had carried guilt, the other a memory. Now both carried each other. The morning began like any other quiet cold and wrapped in the soft hush of freshly fallen snow. Jesse was already outside by the time the sun crested the Pine Ridge, shovel in hand, clearing the ranch's long gravel driveway with steady, deliberate movements. His breath came in frosty puffs, the kind you barely notice when your mind is somewhere else. Inside the bunkhouse, the kids were stirring. Alicia had just started warming formula over the old stove. Daniel watched from the porch, coffee in one hand, the same way he always did, letting the silence speak louder than any advice. Then came a low rumble, faint at first. Daniel squinted toward the horizon. The sound deepened, rolling like distant thunder across the snow-draped fields. Within moments, the first black SUV appeared through the fog. Then a second. Then a third. Two larger military transport trucks followed, tires crunching against the frozen gravel. They didn't stop at the mailbox. They kept going right up the driveway until the lead SUV halted just feet from Jesse's shovel. Jesse froze. Doors opened in unison. From the first vehicle stepped a tall woman in a dark overcoat, her military dress uniform perfectly crisp beneath it. A colonel. Her eyes swept the scene with practiced precision. From the second SUV, a man emerged, slower, older, his movements deliberate. He wore the stars of a general. Daniel set his cup down slowly. The soldiers who stepped from the remaining vehicles formed a silent line along the driveway, boots aligned, faces solemn. The morning had gone from routine to surreal in less than a minute. Jesse slowly stood upright, his gloved hand still gripping the shovel. He didn't move, didn't speak. Alicia had come to the doorway, baby in her arms. The two older kids stood just behind her, their eyes wide. The general stepped forward. His voice was steady but carried across the cold air, like a drumbeat. Sergeant Jesse Turner, he said, you've been carrying a weight that was never yours to bear. Jesse blinked, stunned. I don't understand, sir. Colonel Winters, the tall woman, stepped beside the general, holding a sealed leather portfolio. Your letter to Colonel Garner's widow was passed up the chain? That letter prompted a review. Jesse shook his head. That letter wasn't for anyone else. I just needed her to know I was sorry. She knew, the general interrupted, softening slightly. She also knew the truth. And now so do we. Jesse looked around at the uniforms, the flags on their shoulders, the polished boots in the snow, and his knees nearly buckled beneath him. Daniel was beside him in an instant, steadying his arm. "Easy, son." The general nodded toward the transport trucks. "We didn't come here to shame you. We came to set the record straight." The truth was out. The silence was over. And for Jesse Turner, who had survived war loss and shame redemption, had just pulled into the driveway in full formation. Colonel Winters opened the leather portfolio with a crisp motion, like someone who had done this 100 times, but never in a place like this, never on a snowy ranch surrounded by sheep and the smell of pine wood smoke. She passed the first document to General Harlan, who cleared his throat, then spoke not like a bureaucrat, but like a man who knew what his words would mean. After Colonel Garner's passing, the operation was sealed under classification, the general said. But recent investigations uncovered that your team in Kandahar received corrupted intelligence fed to us by a compromised source working against U.S. forces. Jesse stood motionless, barely breathing. "It wasn't your failure," Colonel Winters added. "It was a setup. And despite that, your actions after the ambush began calling for support, leading the retreat, tending the wounded, saved 17 men and women." A silence fell heavy on the ranch. Alicia gasped softly. Daniel lowered his head, eyes, glassy hands clenched tight. "We're here today to correct the record," the general said firmly. He nodded to a young lieutenant who stepped forward with a small wooden case and handed it to Colonel Winters. She opened it carefully, revealing a bronze star glinting in the pale light. "This," she said, "was recommended by your commanding officer before his death. It was buried in the classified mess until now." Jesse stared at the medal. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, Sergeant," the general replied. "You did your duty, and it's time that's recognized." The general continued, gesturing to another aide who stepped forward with a second case. "Your discharge has been formally upgraded to honorable," he announced. "Retroactive benefits will be restored, including back pay, medical coverage, and family assistance." Behind him, soldiers began unloading crates from the transport trucks, boxes labeled with military stamps and tags. Winter supplies, children's clothing, medical kits, food rations. "We've also coordinated with local authorities and nonprofit support networks," Colonel Winters added. "Your family will receive housing assistance for your move to Idaho. Your kids will be eligible for educational grants through the VA, and we'll see to it that you're never without care again." Alicia covered her mouth. Tears streamed down her face as she turned to Jesse, her voice breaking. "We're not alone anymore." Jesse didn't move. He looked at the medal, then at the soldiers saluting him, then down at his daughter clutching her brother's hand beside the bunkhouse door. "I thought I was forgotten," he whispered. "You were never forgotten," Daniel said, stepping beside him. "You were just waiting to be found." The general reached out and pinned the bronze star onto Jesse's worn civilian jacket right over his heart. In that moment, the wind died, the snow paused, and for the first time in years, Jesse Turner stood not as a ghost of war, but as a soldier fully seen, fully honored, surrounded not by judgment, but by justice. The sound of the convoy hadn't just drawn eyes, it had stirred the town. By the time the last box was unloaded, pickup trucks began appearing one by one at the edge of Daniel Clayton's fence line. Some idled with engines running uncertain. Others pulled all the way in gravel, crunching beneath worn tires. Neighbors who had only ever waved from a distance now stood shoulder to shoulder in the snow, drawn by curiosity, pride, or guilt. Frank Cooper, Daniel's old friend and most vocal critic, was the first to step forward. He took off his hat as he approached, eyes low, boots heavy. His gaze swept over the soldiers, the crates of aid, and finally landed on Jesse, who stood silent beside his family, the medal still pinned to his coat. "I didn't know," Frank muttered, clearing his throat. "Didn't know you were one of them." Jesse looked at him quietly. "One of who?" "A soldier," Frank said. "A good one." Daniel stepped in. "He's also a husband, a father, a man who asked for nothing and gave more than most." There was no sarcasm in Frank now, just the weight of realization. One by one, others joined. The gas station clerk who once looked the other way. The woman from the diner who had once pretended not to see Alicia holding her baby outside in the cold. They came with thermoses of soup, with blankets, with awkward apologies that didn't need words. Daniel's daughter Rebecca stood near the porch, watching it all unfold. She wiped her eyes once, then stepped off the porch and joined Alicia, helping her unpack formula from one of the crates. Michael, her brother, approached Jesse with a quiet nod. "You staying here a while, just until I can get the van running?" Jesse said. "No rush. Michael replied, almost surprised by his own words. The general turned to Daniel. You've always been good at leading from the front. Daniel gave a modest shrug. Didn't do anything special. You did more than most, the general replied. You reminded them of who they are. And that was the truth. In a town that had grown cold not from weather, but from forgetting what mattered. One act of quiet compassion had lit a fire they hadn't felt in years. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the white ground, the ranch was no longer just Daniel's home. It had become a place of reckoning and a place of return. In the weeks that followed, life on the Clayton Ranch took on a rhythm that hadn't been felt in years. Each morning before dawn, Jesse was up clearing the driveway, feeding the livestock, and patching fences that had been ignored since Margaret passed. He worked with quiet purpose, not out of obligation, but as if rebuilding someone else's home helped to stitch something broken inside himself. Daniel watched from the porch most days, letting the younger man take the lead. Not because he couldn't, but because it was time someone else carried the weight. The bunkhouse, once dark and forgotten, now echoed with the sound of life. Emma helped her mother with laundry, proudly mastering the wood stove. Thomas followed Daniel everywhere, asking questions about lambing seasons and hay bales, his curious voice chasing the silence from the fields. Even baby Grace had stopped coughing. Her cries had turned to laughter, bright and unexpected in the bitter chill of winter. Jesse had found a part-time job in town helping a local contractor. His pay wasn't much, but it was enough for gas and dignity. Alicia baked pies and shared them with the neighbors who once judged her from across aisles. No one turned them down anymore. The ranch itself began to change. Where the roof sagged, Jesse reinforced the beams. Where the fields had gone dry, he and Daniel dug new irrigation lines. The land responded. So did the people. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel and Jesse sat side by side, watching the kids build a snowman in front of the bunkhouse. Emma gave it a scarf. Thomas insisted it needed boots. Jesse sipped his coffee, his hands warm around the mug. I keep thinking about that first night, when I knocked on your door. Daniel didn't look at him. What about it? You didn't even hesitate, Jesse said. Didn't know me, had no reason to trust me. But you did. Daniel let out a long breath. You ever been so down that one stranger's kindness felt like oxygen? Jesse nodded slowly. Daniel continued. Back in '93, I broke down outside Cheyenne. VA check hadn't come in. Wife and kids in the car. I was standing at a gas station feeling like the world had forgotten me. Old woman gave me $10, no questions. Said someone did it for me once. You'll do it for someone else. Jesse looked at him. And now you did. No, Daniel said, watching the kids laugh in the snow. Now we did. And in that moment, simple, quiet, and covered in frost, two soldiers, generations apart, understood something most folks never would. Service didn't end with a salute. It lived in what came after. In fences mended, in children warmed, in strangers turned family. Not every act of heroism happens on a battlefield. Sometimes it happens in silence on a snowy porch in a broken-down barn, or at the end of a gravel driveway no one's visited in months. Daniel Clayton didn't save a nation. He didn't lead a battalion. But he opened a door. And in doing so, he reminded an entire town and a forgotten veteran what service really means. Service isn't always loud. It's not medals or parades or uniforms crisp with ceremony. Sometimes it's one man handing over his last dollar without expecting anything back. Sometimes it's saying yes when everyone else says no. And sometimes it's giving someone the chance to stand tall again after years of being bent by shame, by silence, by a world too busy to care. Jesse Turner didn't need pity. He needed a place to land. A chance to be seen not as a mistake, but as a man flawed but faithful. And through Daniel's quiet courage, he got that chance. The snow eventually melted. The kids went back to school. The van got fixed. But something had shifted for Jesse, for Daniel, and for everyone who watched what unfolded. Because long after the convoy left and the uniforms returned to base, a new kind of flag was flying over that ranch. One stitched with second chances, with dignity restored, and with the quiet truth that real honor isn't given by rank. It's lived every day in how we show up for one another. In today's fast-moving world, it's easy to walk past someone who's hurting, to assume the worst, to keep our heads down and tell ourselves it's not my problem. But this story of an old rancher and a forgotten soldier reminds us that doing the right thing rarely makes noise, but it always makes a difference. Daniel didn't have much, just a quiet life and a bit of land. Jesse had nothing but shame and a worn-out uniform. And yet from that unlikely meeting came something powerful, dignity restored trust, rebuilt, and a town reminded of what community used to mean. So maybe the real question isn't, what would you have done? Maybe it's, who around you needs a second chance right now? A neighbor, a veteran, even someone in your own family. Let us know in the comments. Have you ever helped someone when no one else would? Or have you ever been the one in need of kindness? We'd love to hear your stories. Real ones. From people who've lived enough life to know that compassion isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for remembering that some of the strongest heroes don't wear capes or uniforms. They just show up when no one else does. If this story touched your heart, give it a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in the power of quiet goodness. Because kindness, real kindness, never goes out of style.